All too often, we see Carthage only through the lens of military conflict, with comparisons being drawn between it and Rome's military institutions. But what about the far more important institutions that steered the Punic civilization as a whole? Today, we'll be diving into the history of Carthage's government. If you enjoy learning about daily life in the past, I can highly recommend you check out our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. They offer subscription-based on-demand lecture videos put together by top professors from renowned universities and specialists from places like the National Geographic and the Smithsonian. You get unlimited access to a huge library of over 11,000 videos which cover topics from history to science, math, and literature, with new content being added every month. Their history playlist is honestly amazing, and I've been working my way through their 48-part long series on the other side of history. To enrich our own content on Carthage, definitely check out Lecture 16, which explores the fascinating process of colonization in the ancient world. For me, I found it best to download the app on my phone. This allows me to swap from video to audio mode so I can listen to the series as a podcast while going about my daily activities. Right now, the Great Courses Plus is offering a free trial, which you can start by clicking the link in the description below or visiting thegreatcoursesplus.com/invicta. The Carthaginians traced their roots back to ancient Phoenicians of the Bronze Age Levant. As was customary for the era and the region, these forebears were ruled by kings in a monarchical system of government. Thus, when Carthage was founded as a colony, it too was ruled in this top-down manner. We don't have many records of what exactly this looked like, but it seems that such colonies were typically appointed governors by their mother city. These rulers would have acted as the supreme authority for each settlement. Assisting them locally were likely advisors plucked from the leading families of the city. Early on, these individuals would have been wealthy and well-connected aristocrats arriving from Tyre. As the colony grew, however, so too did its aristocracy, as many rose to join their ranks. There were likely many more administrative positions in this early government to deal with things like law, trade, and religion, but sadly we have no records to confirm any conjectures. Carthage's early government lasted for about 200 years, until Tyre fell into decline around the 6th century BC. This shift led to the political independence of its western colonies and appears to have prompted Carthage to adopt a new constitution. Its structure was that of an oligarchic republic. We will recap this briefly now before diving into the details. At the highest level, the position of governor was replaced by that of two annually elected leaders called suffetes, while the governor's aristocratic advising body was transformed into a senate. Together, they would be in charge of proposing legislation and conducting diplomacy. Below them was a popular assembly made up of the wider citizen body. It elected magistrates to higher office and could debate, amend, and ratify proposals handed down to it. Filling out the rest of the bureaucracy would be a host of other magisterial offices and bodies that took up residence across the ever-expanding landscape of Carthage. Over the years, the city and its system of government would continue to evolve as reforms were implemented to meet the needs of the people and the interests of its ruling factions. With this general understanding in place, let's now take a look at the government of Carthage. We will begin from the highest levels and work our way down. As we do so, it will be important to note that in Carthage it was possible for individuals to hold multiple positions simultaneously, a fact which is to be contrasted with the more sequential cursus honorum in Rome. The suffetes were the two chief magistrates at the top of the Carthaginian government. They were elected annually, with evidence pointing to the vote being held through the popular assembly. According to Aristotle, candidates for such high office required sufficient wealth and birth, though we have no details about whether these were actual legal requirements, and if so, what were the minimum thresholds. Surely individuals were at least Carthaginian citizens, but full Punic ancestry does not appear to have been necessary, as can be seen with the election of Hamilcar in 480 BC, whose mother was Greek. Having held previous office, or being able to point to relatives who had, would also have boosted a candidate's chances. Indeed, attaining the position of suffete was a great honor, which would be a point of family pride for generations. So what did these suffetes do? Well, they worked closely with the Senate to steer the ship of state. It appears that their role included convening Senate meetings, making proposals, and consulting with the body on important matters. Because of this close relationship, let's now turn to the Senate for a better understanding of things. The Senate was the chief legislative body composed of somewhere around 200 to 300 members. Within this group, there was possibly an inner council of 30 leading senators or ex-suffetes. Candidates for these higher offices would also have faced similar requirements of wealth and birth as seen with the suffetes, though to a slightly lesser degree. While these certainly served as a great filter for who might stand for office, it appears that social mobility in Carthage was much more fluid than in many other places like Rome, which closely guarded the ranks of their aristocracy. As for how they were elected, we don't really know. Candidates might have been selected by existing members of the Senate, similar to how Roman senators were chosen by consuls or censors. Alternatively, there may have been an element of a democratic vote involving the popular assembly. Okay, so what did the Senate do? Well, principally they met to discuss affairs of state. Such meetings occurred regularly and would have been held in administrative hubs of the city, such as the buildings by the Great Marketplace or within the temple atop the Bursa Hill. Unfortunately, the exact protocols and procedures of these events are lost to time. But regardless of how things took place, we know that the Senate had broad authority over diplomatic, legislative, financial, and military matters. For example, during the Punic Wars, they would be the ones to receive Roman envoys, to declare war and peace, and to authorize the raising and deployment of military forces. The will of the Senate, however, was not the end-all, be-all on such matters. In many cases, proposals had to be submitted to the popular assembly for ratification, either because the matter lacked unanimous consent within the Senate, or simply due to the nature of the proposal in question. Let's now turn to this lower body for discussion. The popular assembly was the voice of the people, composed of the entire Carthaginian citizen body. Now, what exactly made someone a citizen is pretty obscure. Early on, it might have been pretty easy to trace one's ancestry to the initial founders of the city, but as the generations rolled by, this would have been a less and less practical measure. Likely, there would have been magistrates responsible for the census who would have had some standards in place to update the citizen rolls, but again, we're unfortunately left in the dark on these matters. So what did the popular assembly do? Primarily, it elected magistrates and voted on policy decisions. These activities would have taken place in large, public areas where the assembly could reasonably fit, such as in the Great Market of Carthage. Just as with the Senate though, we don't really know about their protocols and procedures. However, one inscription researchers have found in a Libyan country town of this period records how an act was passed, quote, by the votes of all the gates. This would seem to indicate some sort of subgroup voting system based on one's regional or familial association, similar to that of the Roman tribal assembly. But again, we don't really have any direct evidence linking this specific practice to Carthage's popular assembly. Anyways, once these citizens were called up in the assembly, they would proceed to carry out their duties. In times of elections, they would have been able to choose from amongst the candidates running for high office, such as that of the suffete and general. Other times they would have voted on Senate decisions. Here, Aristotle makes a point to state that the popular assembly did not merely sit and listen, but took part in free discussion of the matters at hand. Such participation allowed the people to exercise some degree of control over their government. Their ability to do so would wax and wane over the years, but appears to have gained greater prominence in the 3rd century BC as the people were forced to bear the brunt of the Punic Wars and clamored for greater influence. Now that we've covered the main trunk of the Carthaginian government, let's now talk about other major positions and bodies which made up its branches. One of the first positions I'd like to discuss is that of general. These were individuals appointed to lead the military in times of war. As a result, the availability and number of positions open at any given time would vary greatly. But once a position had to be filled, the candidate would be elected by the popular assembly. Their term of office had no limits, and generals would serve for the duration of a war or until recalled. So what did generals do? Well, as should be fairly obvious, they commanded armies or fleets. This would have involved supervising the raising of forces, conducting training, and leading their troops into battle. Generals could act independently or might work together in senior and junior capacities. One important point to mention is that the role of the Carthaginian general was purely military and separated from civil duties, which is to be heavily contrasted with the Roman system of warrior politicians. However, this distinction is not entirely black and white, since clearly it took political power to get elected general, and in theory, Carthaginian generals could simultaneously hold other offices, which might widen their total powers. The next series of government positions fall into a broad category of commissions. These were basically groups of magistrates who dealt with a variety of important public tasks. For instance, we have records mentioning a 5-man group for judging law cases, a 10-man group for overseeing sacred places, and a 30-man group for supervising taxes. These individuals appear to have been chosen by existing board members, going on to serve longer terms of office than most officials. But perhaps one of the most prestigious commissions was the Court of 104. This was a group of high judges appointed by merit who served for life. Their main duty appears to have been the oversight of military commanders, investigating generals or their officers, and punishing them for bad behavior. This might range from admonishing or fining commanders for their treatment of prisoners, to full-on crucifying generals for their defeats. While on the surface seemingly impartial, these trials must have been quite political, as generals were very often powerful figures with many important connections who wouldn't go down so easily without a fight. One must therefore imagine that such investigations often involved a lot of backdoor deal-making and the exchange of money and favors. Nonetheless, it was still an important institution that commanded much respect and served to keep the Punic military in line. Beyond this, we know very little. However, given the size and complexity of the Carthaginian civilization, there are surely many more bureaucratic positions lying beneath the shrouded surface of our historical record. After all, its institutions were highly praised by philosophers of the age. Isocrates, for instance, called it the best system of any state alongside Sparta, while Aristotle declared it to be a sound blend of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Indeed, from what little records we have of the Punic state, it appears to have been quite a stable government with few incidents of rising tyrants as can be seen in the Greek world, or uprising commoners as can be seen in the conflict of the orders in Rome. It is therefore fascinating to speculate what the ancient world might have looked like had the Punic model not been crushed under the boots of war. But alas, it seems we shall never know. A huge thanks to our researchers, writers, and artists who made this video possible, and to our patrons who fund the channel. Stay tuned for more exciting episodes on the hidden history of Carthage.